I'd like to turn the time over to our speakers, Sandy Wingert and Arianna Mason. Sandy is with the Utah Division of Water Quality, and Arianna is with SWCA Environmental Consultants.
Thank you. So my name is Sandy Wingert. I work for the Division of Water Quality. I am a watershed scientist. I've been working with the division since 2007, so quite a long time, and have been really focusing efforts within the Provo River watershed since 2012, I would say. And I would also like to introduce my co-speaker, Ari Mason. She works for SWCA, has been there for 5 years, and has been jointly working with me up in the Heber Valley watershed during that time on several initiatives with a lot of the stakeholders up in this watershed. So what we'd like to talk about today, again, is a brief introduction about why we're talking about what we're talking about today and how does this fit more within the planning efforts of restoration activities that can be applied, across the state. We're talking about the case example of Spring Creek E. coli TMDL, total maximum daily load. I'll explain that in a second. Ari will go in and talk to you guys about what an EPA 9-element plan is. How do we develop a Heber Valley plan, why we're deeming it a success, and I'll bring it together in the end to talking about how we've met the short-term and mid-term deliverables, how we measure success, and then open up for questions after that. Okay, so this is not all of everything that we have worked within. What we're saying is the watershed is pretty much anything that drains into Deer Creek Reservoir. So the area of focus is really between the Jordanelle and Deer Creek Reservoir. Deer Creek Reservoir, we developed a TMDL for phosphorus, temperature, and dissolved oxygen in the early 2000s. Again, there's been a lot of talk of nutrients and harmful algal blooms. This was kind of like the poster child for that prior to Utah Lake. Utah Lake's harmful algal blooms and the attention it got. In 2008, the Mitigation Commission came in and really restored the Middle Provo. It's a premier cold water fishery habitat, minimum in-stream flows that are required now in that stretch. 2012 and 13 is really we started working with the local communities. So the little town of Wallsburg, Main Creek area, it's a direct tributary into Deer Creek Reservoir. And they kind of led the charge with the Wasatch Conservation District looking at these planning efforts. Since then, we have dumped is a wrong word to say, so we have invested over about $3 to $5 million, depending upon if you want to do in-kind match or state or federal funds to restore this creek. We've had really good success, and the creek is impaired for E. coli, temperature, and phosphorus as well. In 2021, I developed the Spring Creek E. coli TMDL. 2023, the Heber Valley Watershed Plan was finalized, and now we have secured additional funding through federal partners to start implementing the project work that was outlined in both the TMDL and the 9-element watershed plan. So I'm not going to go through all this. Most of you, well, maybe you've heard me speak on this several times at the symposium in the past, but from the Division of Water Quality, everything that we do as it's per the Clean Water Act or the Utah Water Quality Act. We designate beneficial uses of the waters. Are they for culinary, recreational, agricultural uses? We set standards to protect those uses. We do a bunch of monitoring to determine exactly where we are. If we meet those uses, we continue on, and in every 2-year cycle, every state is required to report back to EPA. We call it the integrated report. And then if they are not meeting, right, the water chemistry is over those numeric standards then, so that it doesn't meet water quality standards, we say it's impaired. My world realms in between the TMDL study. We also address water quality impairments through permitting and also through the non-point source program, which is a grant incentive-based programs that we work with, volunteer land managers on. So that we have a couple different management options at the division to address these impairments. Total maximum daily load study, which I'll start talking about on the next slide. We can look at site-specific criteria, looking at the use. Is it a cold water fishery and it should be a warm water, or vice versa? And then also we can go to watershed planning and project implementation. So Total maximum daily load is the maximum amount of pollutant a water body can receive and still meet its beneficial uses. So how much loading can Deer Creek Reservoir get from the phosphorus without tripping or exceeding that numeric criteria then that's still protective of the cold water aquatic life use. It incorporates, point sources, which is anything kind of come like a discrete source from a pipe. It can also be from non-point source, like what's over the land. And there's also a margin of safety because nothing is ever perfect. So when we talk about Spring Creek E. coli TMDL, the Spring Creek watershed is just this little tiny, we call it an assessment unit. Think of it, in this case, is smaller than a Huck 12. It's 20 square miles, it's really small. But as you drive like on Highway 40 going into Heber and you look out to the view and you see like Mount Timpanogos and you see those green fields, yes? Okay, then that's what we're talking about. Those green fields is exactly what we call Spring Creek E. coli TMDL, or the Spring Creek area. 99% privately owned, a lot of grazing and agriculture here. And this is what we're seeing more and more is these rural communities where they have those grazing, they've got E. coli problems. However, the development pressure is so great within this area that it's this nexus between, the downstream users and the developed flows coming into it. So again, this is not part of a regulated MS4 community or stormwater community. So we're looking about how do we protect the natural resources, which with the local community wants to protect their needs, but balance regulation or balance regulation and development at the same time. So it is a kind of a hot mess. So one summary slide showing over a 200-page report in 2 years or 3 years worth of work boils down to this. This creek was originally listed in the 2012 impaired list, like we talked about, for failing to protect its cold water aquatic, or this cold water 1C culinary uses and infrequent contact recreation due to elevated levels of E. coli. Basically, there's too much E. coli in there for people to drink and recreate safely. We showed that during this time it exceeded our standard 71% of the time. After the TMDL analysis, we concluded that that no matter if it was low flow conditions or high flow conditions, it still exceeded over all flow regimes. In order to meet water quality standards during the recreational season, which is May through October, we needed an 81% reduction in E. coli loading in order to be protective of human health. In 2021, this TMDL was approved by both the Water Quality Board and by EPA. Sources, you guess it, we have it. Unregulated stormwater coming in from Heber City, Wasatch County areas, agricultural communities, both crops and grazing. All of the yellow dots up here are parcels of land that have septic tanks on it. The water type table is really shallow here. So we have a lot of intrusion from that. And then we also have Jordanelle Special Service District, which is a wastewater treatment facility at the head area of the watershed. So again, it's a plethora of sources. So what we did with the TMDL then is when I talked about how it exceeded at all flow regimes, basically this is where the data, this is high flow, low flow conditions, and anytime we see data above the red line is where we see exceedances. So again, this really starts to hone in on what the sources are. And using this matrix here that we have that is a EPA developed matrix that states use nationwide, we can kind of start pointing into what these potential sources are. So again, considering that we've got, sources, we got exceedances in all flow regimes, then you can see here where they're kind of the highlighted orange ones then is stormwater upland, bankland erosion, stormwater impervious surface cover, point sources here, on-site septic systems. So again, we had a diverse sources of E. coli pollution within this little tiny watershed. So breaching from that to where we are now and working a lot with the local community here, this screenshot was taken from EPA, and there's several different ways that you can go about developing these kind of more planning documents, and we are at this first phase, right? So we've identified the problem, there's too much E. coli, there's too much nutrients in the water. We developed a TMDL, and then we have developed and implemented for 2 years now this watershed plan. We're conducting monitoring, and then the whole goal of all of this then is to meet water quality standards and protect human health.
So before I dive into specifically what we did for the Heber Valley watershed plan, I wanted to just give a brief overview of EPA 9-element watershed plans. So in the 1980s, state, federal, tribal agencies started taking more of a holistic watershed planning approach versus just like projects here and there. They're like, let's take a look at the entire watershed and see what makes sense. To help with those efforts, EPA developed a handbook for creating watershed plans. And those plans include an assessment of water quality issues, pollutant sources, and different recommended management practices. So this graphic here is the 6 steps to watershed planning. So you have building partnerships, characterizing the watershed, setting goals, designing an implementation program, actually implementing the plan, measuring and making adjustments, and then improving the plan. It actually is pretty iterative and adaptive. These plans are meant to be able to be updated and changed over the years as there's progress that's measured and maybe adjustments that need to be made. So these are the basic elements the EPA has kind of identified are like the key elements to a watershed planning document to be successful and meet those water quality criteria that Sandy has discussed. So these elements are all within those 6 steps. There's, on this figure on the right, there's more than 9 elements that you can address. Those are just the minimum. And these also, you might hit some of these elements within multiple steps. Like you might be evaluating data as you're building partnerships as well as when you're characterizing the watershed. So it doesn't work exactly in a step-by-step process. The benefits of developing these plans: improved water quality and ecosystem health. These EPA 9-element watershed plans are very detailed. They get really into the analysis and like on-the-ground implementation projects that are planned out. Access to state and federal funding. Often these plans are kind of open the door for other funding from the state or EPA for those on-the-ground implementation programs. You often have to have one of these plans for your watershed that outline recommended activities that are backed by the data analysis to then get that funding. And then strengthened community involvement and education. A huge part of these plans is community involvement, stakeholder engagement. The Heber Valley plan specifically was developed in an area where there was already a lot of work with that, and so that was a huge reason, that I think that plan has been a huge success. But often these plans, you come to the end of it and really you've strengthened a lot of your community partnerships and stakeholder engagement in your watershed. Who typically spearheads these plans? There's a number of different agencies and organizations that can do that. Typically in Utah, entities that have led the charge for these plans, that have applied for that state funding, different counties, cities, conservation districts, watershed councils, NGOs, and state agencies are also involved as well. How do these plans get funded? There's a lot of steps and a lot of elements and a lot of analysis. The actual plan development is typically funded through the state non-point source funding. So you apply for funding, the state grants it, and then that is the chunk of money for developing the actual plan. Following the plan and implementing it, there are a number of different funding sources for those implementation projects. These are just a few. So jumping into the actual Heber Valley watershed plan, the EPA 9-element plan, the study area is comprised of multiple HUC 12s, and Sandy kind of explained, everything between Jordanelle and Deer Creek. The Wasatch Conservation District is part of the Provo River Watershed Council, which is a group of stakeholders that are active in this watershed. They secured funding for this watershed plan through the state of Utah. SWCA developed the plan in coordination with the Provo River Watershed Council and DWQ. It was a very involved process with all of those entities. And then in this map, you can see there is a red kind of project planning area. That area was decided upon based on existing understanding of the watershed and other documents like the TMDL that Sandy talked about as a focused area for those implementation projects coming out of the plan. So most of the implementation projects that were developed were focused on that area. However, a lot of those activities could also be applied to other parts of the watershed. And the goal for this plan was to create a framework for watershed restoration, promote that watershed scale approach, and ultimately improve the water quality to meet those standards that Sandy mentioned. So to start the planning process, we engaged with stakeholders. That's really critical for these plans, as implementation takes involvement from multiple stakeholders. So this was kind of our engagement process of working with those stakeholders. So we identified and convened the key stakeholders. There was some initial outreach specifically to private landowners first, and that was in August of 2021. There was a producer dinner where we gave kind of an overview of the watershed plan, what was to be expected, how they could be involved, and really getting their input as well from the beginning. What are the issues that they see? You know, they're on the ground, so what are they seeing and how can that affect the plan? And then in October, we had an agency-only meeting, state agency, et cetera. And then from both of those, we were able to make a watershed plan advisory committee. That committee still meets to discuss the plan and track progress, which has been really successful. And then part of that also was a streamside tour where you're able to go out with the different stakeholders and producers and visit actual areas in the watershed and look at, you know, eroded stream banks, et cetera. Coming out of stakeholder engagement, we were able to identify key threats and challenges. So you can see these down here are the impairments that Sandy's talked about, and we were kind of able to say, what are the stressors in the watershed? What are the sources of those stressors? How are they impacting and causing these impairments? And that led into the watershed characterization, which is the first two elements of the EPA 9-element planning process, identifying sources of pollution and determining the load reductions needed. So these are just a few examples of the data analysis that we did. You know, over here on the right is looking at annual phosphorus load at different locations along the Provo River, upstream to downstream. So you can see, you know, in areas where maybe your loading went up significantly, you can look into that area a little bit closer and see what's going on, maybe target some projects in that area. This is another example of looking at E. coli during the recreation versus the non-recreation season, et cetera. So part of this watershed characterization is really kind of fleshing out, like, where are the sources of pollution? And then going into the load reductions needed, most of that came from the existing TMDLs that were developed in this area. And we also used the EPA PLET model. And so that's what you see summarized in this table. It's just an estimate of phosphorus load per watershed. And then coming out of the watershed characterization, we were also able to say, what are the data gaps? You know, Sandy mentioned stormwater. There's a lot of development in this watershed and not a lot of data on what is that stormwater carrying, what kind of pollutants is it transporting, et cetera. And that leads into the implementation plan, which kind of covers the rest of those 9 elements. Developing management measures, developing an actual implementation plan. What are the financial needs of that plan? How do we monitor to see how that plan is progressing? What are the benchmarks? So this is an example. I know you probably can't see all of it very well, but down here at the bottom is just a snip from our full implementation plan table. We have multiple implementation activities, structural BMPs, non-structural BMPs, and information and outreach. So that might be, you know, structural, maybe you have livestock exclusion fencing. Non-structural BMPs might be grazing management plans or stormwater monitoring, and then information and outreach, you know, educational events, stormwater coalitions, et cetera. So we were able to outline each of those implementation activities in this table, looking at what stressors are each implementation activity targeting, what is the expected results, what are the estimated costs, and then we were able to pair that with this map up here, which, again, I know you can't see very well, but there's kind of a location for each implementation activity. So you can have the table and the map and have a really good game plan of, like, what activity is going to be most impactful at what areas in the watershed. And then on the top left is our schedule here. So these were developed in different timeframes: short-term, mid-term, long-term, et cetera. These are just a couple of the identified funding for the actual implementation project. So part of the implementation plan is to look at what are possible funding sources for the implementation activities, so that stakeholders can take this plan and say, you know, I want to do X project, and here's a funding table that can show them what are the options for how to fund that project. What are the deadlines for that funding? What are the requirements for those applications? So that's all part of the implementation plan that we developed. And these are just a few examples of the different funding programs that can support those on-the-ground implementation activities that come out of this watershed plan. This is another application that the Provo River Watershed Council has invested in. It is a online experience builder, and I'll just briefly click through it, but where we look at water quality data, this is updated annually. So this is just an example for E. coli. You can look at monitoring locations across the watershed. You can click on individual points, pulls up what beneficial uses, what assessment unit those are in, period of record, et cetera. And then there are summary figures for each monitoring location that show concentrations by month, specific concentrations over time. And then you can see there's these different water quality parameters that are also plotted, so you can see where those exceedances are. And so that's part of the monitoring and evaluation component of this plan that the council and the state has supported to be able to see how are the activities that we're implementing over time actually changing water quality. And then there's an interactive map that they can reference real time, grab screenshots from to see, and use for even applications for some of those implementation activities. With that, I'll hand it back over to Sandy.
To implement, really, it's like we come up with these successes, like what defines success, and as part of this iteration, this iterative process then is you got to keep going back on a yearly basis and saying, okay, where are we at and where do we need to pivot? How do we need to change? So for this short term, we're talking about 1 to 2 years, shovel-ready projects, focus areas on those north fields, again, that greenscape at the base of Timpanogos as you're going into Heber. The success that this group has determined then is working with one private landowner to do volunteer project work and to start coming up with a stormwater management plan for the region, for the Heber Valley that is not currently regulated, on a state level. And so where are we at? So this has been success because we didn't do one, we did 2. So we have 2 agriculture-related projects within this area that are being implemented now. We secured funding for Wasatch County to develop a regional stormwater management plan that allows all the entities or the municipalities to come in and have a standardized practice for developers so that the practices and the engineering specs that for Heber is the same as Midway or Charleston or Hideout. And that was a big concern that the local community had. We were also successful in securing about $600,000 to $1 million over the next 5 years of NRCS money to work with private agricultural landowners as well in this area. So far to date, since 2018, and within this watershed, we have just about $1 million of non-point source and federal funds available, and another $600,000. 2 to 5 years. So this is more projects that involve a little bit more planning and coordination. To determine success, they were very, at this time, 2 years ago, I thought this was very aggressive that they wanted to secure funding to redo that Deer Creek Reservoir TMDL, which was a beast of a study done in 2002. They wanted to, reduce E. coli and phosphorus into the reservoir, stormwater projects, and grazing management plans. And since then, the Provo River Watershed Council has developed its own strategic plan, again, looking at stressors within the environment, and we're able to take steps to minimize these risks. But what was nice, though, is that this congruent effort then did align very well with what the original 9-element plan said. We've developed several stream bank restoration projects, and the big one then again is looking at the stormwater project, coming up with a GIS mapping exercising toolbox. We're doing a workshop, Main Creek projects, and again the stormwater management plan. And also, this will be my next project, is that because of the priority then that was identified, the DWQ has confirmed that we will revise the Deer Creek TMDL and what that means to determine exactly what the phosphorus content loading is coming through this. So again, success. Longer picture again, these are up to 10 years out. Just really keep on that discussion at the Wasatch County Conservation District, the regional meetings, interlocal meetings, really about how do we balance development and the development pressures and making sure that we keep that open space open for current land managers or agricultural community, that they want to do that. That has been a big part of it, and also increased monitoring for PFAS as well. And like Ari mentioned, is that the technical advisory committee still meets, once or twice a year to determine where we are at with this. And it's been really good project getting together both the local community and the agency folks together in the same room without, having a knockdown, drag-out fight.
So I noticed in the study, in the TMDL, there was 2 agricultural projects.
Yeah.
Does that mean, could that possibly mean, or would that mean maybe a big or critical load for E. coli was coming from pastures or feedlots or something like that? Or is there any reason why it would be on-site wastewater, stuff like that?
Wastewater is so wastewater is definitely a part of it, failing septic tanks. We're working with the health department to address that. But with those 2 agricultural projects that we've got more than that. It was just that period of term, and it was just 1, and we've got 2 to date. Most of it for E. coli is coming from those pasture cows that we've determined. The problem also with this is that UDOT's doing a bypass road through those fields, and so a lot of project work is being on held right now because we don't want to go out there and doing project work that's just going to be commandeered in a year. So everything, to be honest, is kind of a frustration, but we're kind of putting that on hold until we determine exactly where that route's going to go. But yeah, most of it's coming from cattle.
Cool stuff.
Awesome, thanks.
Maybe for one or both, or if one of you has a better idea. From a data management side, I'm just kind of curious how SWCA thinks, or even DWQ, how do you think about archiving or making the data this open, like your GIS map? It's great to click on a dot and see all the metadata, but is the open data available? Is it kind of going into a data repo for SWCA? Is it hosted by DWQ? How do you kind of balance this data analysis over these multi-year, multi-decade projects to make the data relevant and available and accessible down the road?
Yeah. So I can start and then you can. So all the data is within our database and it's public facing. So you can pull all the raw data, you can do your own analysis, you can do that. But the summary of this analysis is...
Yeah, so we take the data straight from DWQ's database, download it, that's updated annually. They do a data dump of all of their annual data, and then we have our code that we are processing the data through to then generate the figures and data that's in that story map, or the experience builder. And that is actually hosted by SWCA, but it is like public facing, and we have it set up to be open, for a certain period of time.
Maybe I'll ask after, but what's the contractual obligation to keep that data portal alive? Like, does that have a 5-year time frame, and then I'm going to go and it's going to be a dead link, or is there contingencies about that? I don't know.
That's a good question. We've had a contract with the Provo River Watershed Council for a number of years. That's kind of an ongoing contract to update it every year, and haven't really had that discussion of what happens when that contract ends. But it is available, we have it set up to be open, to still be accessible even after we're not under contract.
Yeah, so the Provo River Watershed Council, it's hosted there, but if we were ever going to break that, I kind of wear 2 hats here, that we own it, and so we would just operate it in-house instead. But before we did this, all this was done in paper reports that were done on a yearly basis, and it really, nobody is going to look at that. So we did switch gears a couple years ago and went to more of this type of story map experience builder.
But DWQ's GIS team has access to the experience builder as well, so yeah.
And I think we're out of time for questions.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Another round of applause for Sandy and Arianna.